Hello and welcome. My name is Inderjeet Singh-Nijhar. I'm the chair of the Political Economic Circle. Tonight we're discussing four trade unions and a pandemic. That's our theme. And we have amongst us four speakers. Manuel Cortes, the General Secretary of the TSSA Union, Mary Bousted from the National Education Union, Rita Holbourne, who is replacing Ian Lawrence from the NAPO Union, who represents the Artists Union in England and is the Vice President of the CPS Civil Service Union. And in place of Len McCluskey, who sadly has to attend a funeral this evening, we have Howard Beckett, the Assistant General Secretary for Political and Legal side of that particular unit. I'm grateful particularly to Rita and Howard for stepping into the breach at such a late hour. In terms of the format this evening, we are recording the event like we always do for our social media channel for the club. I will introduce the panel, which I've done briefly, and I will invite them to introduce themselves and talk about any specific issues that are pertinent to their sector. We'll have a brief discussion amongst the panel for a few minutes, and then I'll open up the lines to our members and guests on Zoom to put any particular questions they may have to our panelists. And then that will be followed by a vote of thanks from Nick Kirby and Val Stansfield this evening, and then we'll close the event. It goes without saying that four trade unions represented this evening represent something in the order of 50% plus of the national union membership in England and Wales. They represent sectors such as aviation to retail, to transport, on our roads to rail, and to the hospitality sector, artists to performers, public sector workers in our NHS, in our schools, in local government and national government. We will go on to hear how they've played a pivotal role in influencing the government policy since the pandemic began, and how it's taken a footballer to get the government to not produce one, but two U-turns for the very needy in our communities, particularly around free school meals. And that's a pretty shameful set of events for a country that's fifth or the sixth largest economy in the world. So at that point, I'd like to invite Manuel Cortes. And before you begin, Manuel, I know you and Howard have to attend an urgent meeting this evening. I'm grateful that you're here. Despite that, there's a meeting being held with the leader of the opposition who happened to have moved it so we can meet this evening, and I'm grateful for it. So over to you, Manuel.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. Can I start off by thanking you and the Liberal Club for inviting me along to this event. I'm delighted to be with you, and I know that quite a lot of people are joining us this evening, so I'm really pleased that we're going to have such a good audience. My union organizes workers predominantly in public transport, so many of our members have been heroes throughout the pandemic because they've kept our country moving. They've ensured that other essential workers, such as those working in our NHS, have been able to get to work. They have ensured, for example, in Scotland, that ferry services, which provide lifelines for remote communities in the islands of Scotland, have continued to operate. And of course, in freight in general on our railways, they've been moving medicines and other materials around our country. And our job as a union has been to ensure that those who have remained at work throughout this crisis have had the best protection that could have been offered towards them to ensure that they did not end up with COVID themselves. So it has been a very challenging time. Unfortunately, some rail workers have died as a result of COVID, and we lost one of our members at Victoria Station after an incident with a passenger, which became very controversial, but actually it did catch the mood of the country at the time when barely our member died in Victoria. There was politicians from all across the political spectrum actually praising the work that frontline workers have been doing and criticizing the actions that led to her untimely and unwarranted death. Look, I think it's key to highlight the impact that unions have been having throughout this crisis. The Economist newspaper, not a friend, Economist magazine, not a friend of working people, carried a front page that said unions are back. Of course, that was disingenuous. Unions haven't gone away. But the fact that the Economist recognized the pivotal role that unions have been playing throughout this crisis says a lot about the work that we've been doing. Because a lot of what we do never hits the headlines. The amount of stuff that we sort out day in, day out for our members hardly ever gets noticed by anybody other than those members who have benefited from the actions of our union. And of course, and I know probably Howard will touch on this, we wouldn't have a furlough scheme if it hadn't been for the work that trade unions did in pushing this. Many million more of our citizens would be today unemployed if it hadn't been for the role that the unions did in pushing for some protection from the government for our economy as a whole. We also organize, that it happens, retail workers in our travel trade, and it's been decimated. Retail travel trade shops are in danger of becoming a thing of the past. So we've been urging even greater support for this sector of our economy. Even today, in the House of Lords, one of our members, who happens to be a Lord, was moving questions to the Minister about why more support and bespoke support was not being given to our travel trade. So look, I'm going to finish on this point. The roles of the unions throughout this crisis has been extensive. First, we've ensured that our members who are at work are as protected as they could be. Second, we've ensured that key supply lines that are being kept going in transport, that those have continued to run to ensure that the medicines and key workers can get to place. And I think the third one is that we've influenced government decisions to try and minimize the economic impact that unfortunately, the health emergency is now creating a deep economic crisis, to minimize the economic impact that is going to have on workers. And the final point that we'll make is that we will have a role even after, hopefully, we have conquered this virus, because all research is pointing that our mental health would not be as good as it would have been if we hadn't had the COVID pandemic. So really, unions will be playing a big role there as well in safeguarding the interests of our members as we move forward. So over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was slightly over the allocated time, but I share your passion and where you're coming from. Mary, can I turn to you now for your 2 to 3 minutes?
Thank you very much, Inderjeet. Well, the first thing I would say is that nobody can say anything other about the COVID pandemic than it is a terrible thing. It's been a terrible, terrible thing for our society, and the world and our own countries would be immeasurably better if COVID had not happened. And the loss of life and the illness and the harm it's done to our economy will take, will be very hard to recover from. But for the National Education Union, we have 450,000 members. We're the 4th largest union in the TUC, and our union has grown by 50,000 members since the start of the COVID pandemic. And what we have discovered is that when members or potential members are afraid, when they are troubled, when they are challenged, when they do not believe that the state is going to look after them, then they look around, and if the union is there for them, they join. And what's happened during the COVID pandemic is that the NEU has absolutely learned to work in new ways, because we've had to. So to just give an example, after Boris Johnson announced in May that all schools would be going back fully before the end of June, all primary schools, we had a Zoom call on the 18th of May, and on that Zoom call we had over 20,000 members on the Zoom call. And that just shows that we think that's the biggest Zoom call ever. And they wanted to know what your union is saying, what your union thinks that education should be about, what your union thinks there should be about safe working, and what your union thinks about how schools and colleges can be kept safe and education sustained during a pandemic. We've had our website has had over 10 million viewers in the last 2 months. Again, those aren't just members, those are members of the public who want to know what is the NEU saying, how do they keep their children safe, or what are the issues for the profession, what do we know about the science. And we've now got our highest rep density ever. So we've increased our rep density, and the reps are the people who represent the union in school. We've increased our rep density from just under 30% to nearly 50%. So 78% of our members in secondary schools now are in schools with a rep, with the union, which is the rep is the living embodiment of the union in the workplace. So what the pandemic has done for the NEU is to show our members the power of being in a union, the presence of being in a union, and the potential of being in a union in order to enable education to improve, but also to support them working in the safest possible workplaces that can do. And I'll finish with this. Uniquely, amongst workers, teachers and support staff are being required to go into crowded buildings without personal protective equipment, without social distancing, without adequate cleaning, without adequate ventilation to enable education to take place. And when you ask those things of people, we say to the government, then if you're going to ask them to make these huge, huge sacrifices, you have to do everything you can to protect them. And we do not believe this is the case. So that is the subject of a major row I had with the government minister just before I came on. So if I'm a bit combative, it's just because I've had to make those points very clearly to a government minister. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Mary. You're amongst friends here, so thank you for that. Zita, can I turn to you now for your input from the artists' angle and as a vice president of the CPS?
Okay, thank you, and thanks for having me here, and glad to be able to stand in place of Ian Lawrence. So yes, I'm predominantly speaking here on behalf of Artists Union England, but I'm also the Vice President of the Public and Commercial Services Union, PCS, which is a civil service union. So I'll start with a focus on Artists Union England. We're one of the newest unions in the UK. We're only a few years old, so we're still growing and still organising and mobilising to build our union. But we're probably in quite an unusual situation compared to some of the other unions represented here, in that the vast majority of our members are self-employed. So they're, not in employment with an employer as an artist. The majority of our members are women, and the majority of them are socially engaged artists. So they're artists that work in the community. They're not the world-renowned artists, and they're not, selling paintings for millions of pounds. They work in communities with vulnerable people, and working with people who face discrimination and disadvantage in society, and play an important role in healing, in therapy, in education, and awareness raising through the arts. And their situation is such that when the pandemic hit, literally all of their work was cancelled with immediate effect for the foreseeable future, with no knowledge of when they might get work again. So any commissions they had cancelled, exhibitions cancelled. The knock-on impact on the the wider impact on the arts and culture sector means that the work that they would engage in and the organisations in the sector that they would work with, the museums and galleries, for example, closing their doors meant that the work is not there for them. So they were in really dire straits, and actually the response by the government in the early days was totally inadequate, in that they weren't really looking at a model of support for our members and people like our members, because there are other people, you know, in the arts and culture and leisure sector who also impacted. They weren't looking at self-employed and the large proportion of people who are self-employed. Because our members are largely low-paid artists working in a socially engaged way and on temporary short-term contract self-employed work, a lot of them also have another part-time job. And their part-time job tends to be, whether it's working in retail or catering or a fast food restaurant or as a cleaner, that sort of thing. They are also jobs that are precarious work that have been hit hard by the pandemic too. So they've literally lost all of their income. So we've been involved with lobbying the government and questioning their strategy in terms of leaving out self-employed people, but also our members have fallen through the gaps when they did start to provide measures for self-employed people, because you had to prove your finances and earn over a certain amount and be full-time self-employed. So they've really been hit hard. Our whole sector has been hit hard. In PCS, whilst the majority of our members are civil servants, it's the largest civil service union, we also organise workers in the arts and culture sector who work in the national museums and galleries and historical palaces. And these are all workers that are low paid, largely migrant women, Black and minority ethnic workers who have also been hit and are being targeted for redundancy. So we've already had members in museums out taking strike action because their jobs were threatened. So there's an element of discrimination in terms of what measures are there, who's supported, and how people are impacted. And our members in the civil service have been very much involved in administering the government's measures and benefits and working through the pandemic as key workers.
Okay.
I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for that. And I will return to some of these things, no doubt, as the evening progresses. Thanks ever so much. Howard, thank you for stepping in at the 11th hour in Len's shoes, which are very difficult to fill, as we all know. But over to you.
Thank you, Inderjeet, and many thanks for the invitation. I want to tackle tonight the issue of the inequality that has been shown on society through COVID. It is a truth that if you're poor, you're twice as likely to die from COVID if you contract it. Obviously, we know it discriminates against Black and ethnic minority communities, but it has discriminated throughout this crisis towards workers. We have a great deal as a movement to congratulate ourselves for. Obviously, as Manuel referenced, the furlough scheme would not have come into existence had it not been for the support and the backing and the pressure of the trade union movement. But the reality is that workers have been put in harm's way through this crisis. If I take, for an example, an executive member that we have who works in Sainsbury's, and because the government failed to describe essential and non-essential work during the first wave of the COVID crisis, she was told by Sainsbury's that her work was essential because she was feeding the nation. And she responded by saying, how about giving me a wage that's sufficient for me to feed my family? And therein lies the injustice of society that we should all recognise now. Sainsbury's, part of the major supermarket companies who have received £1.9 billion in business rates relief through this crisis, and already have paid out £1.3 billion in dividends. Sainsbury's, who have announced 3,500 job losses in Argos on its in-house counters in supermarket counters through this crisis. And let me take the example, Inderjeet, of British Airways, where I led for the union in respective negotiations. 42,000 workers 12,000 of them told that they would be made redundant, and the other 30,000 told that they would be fired and rehired on new contractual terms. Told that on the day of Workers' Memorial Day, when the cabin crew were burying one of their own who had contracted and died from coronavirus from repatriating British citizens around the world. The reality of British Airways is that the year before COVID, they made almost £2 billion in profit through the terms and conditions that they had with our members. Yet here they were using the opportunity of COVID to sack everyone and re-employ them on dramatically reduced terms and conditions with layoff clauses imposed in those terms and conditions. British Airways makes 66% of the profit for the IAG group, and they did not look to do the same with IAG or with Aer Lingus. Why? Because the laws of those countries prevented it. So moving forward, coming out of this crisis, we as a movement must be bold. There are 5.5 million public sector workers who have gone to work through this crisis, kept the country moving, not the spids and speculators or the banks, but the workers have kept the country moving. And they are already being told that they will have a pay freeze and in real terms, a pay cut. Already the language of public sector worker against private sector worker. Coming out of the first wave, how quickly did we forget clapping for people on a Thursday night and return to the same narrative of how are we going to pay for this crisis? Coming out of 2008, Inderjeet, we did not get so much as the Robin Hood tax. The stock market has gone up by £1.4 trillion in value since 2008. The top 1,000 people and earners in the country have gone up, their wealth has gone up by £450 billion since 2008. But workers in real terms have lost wages of £430 billion since 2008. So now is the time for the trade union movement really to be heard and to talk about the spirit of 1946, where people returned from the Second World War with debt at twice the rate that it is now as a percentage to GDP. Yet they built the social state, they built the NHS, they demanded that their children go to third tier education, and they built 1 million council houses. That is what is needed for us now, Inderjeet. I would say to everybody in this Zoom, the choice is now binary. There are only two ways to pay for this crisis. Either workers will pay for it with their jobs and with their wages, or wealth will pay it. And my union sits firmly on the side that wealth must pay it.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Howard, for that. That's that sort of completes the whole picture. I just wanted to pick up a few of those themes that emerged from all your contributions, particularly around the public sector freeze that's been sort of mooted by the Treasury. The budget is being announced by the Chancellor on Wednesday. Unusually, it's not a 3-year settlement, it'll be an annual settlement. And it's the pressure, it's kind of on really. I mean, the issues that Mary talked about, issues that Zita talked about, and Manuel and yourself, which, I mean, I don't want to go to each of the panelists asking for an individual response from this, but the issue really is around, yes, the claps don't pay for food on the table. The NHS heroes that we were all clapping are now very much in the sights of the Chancellor, the public sector workers in the sights of the Chancellor. So just asking a genuine question to any of you can answer this. Why would the public sector pick up the tab?
Because it always does. Public sector, if you look at the history of teachers' wages, in the last 10 years, there's been, when we hit austerity, it was teachers who had a 0%, and then a very small pay increase over a 3-year period. And, the issue is that, and it's going to happen because the Centre for Policy Studies reported that it was going to happen. And that's one of the outlets that the government uses when it's got unpalatable things to tell us. But here's the issue. It's now the case that within 3 years of qualifying, nearly a third of teachers leave the profession. Within 10 years, it's over 40% of teachers leave the profession. We are constantly running to try and stand still for teachers, and they leave for two key reasons. The first one is excessive workload. So teachers work more unpaid overtime than any other profession. And during this pandemic, with schools open, they are absolutely, if you heard the stories I hear from members about the stress and pressure they're under now, you would weep. Some of them, you know, we've just done a survey of our membership, and when we asked them how stressed they were, on what scale to 10, over half the members said that they were stressed on a scale from 8 to 10, and over 25%, over a quarter, said they are at number 10. They find that the challenge of keeping a school open and COVID secure and teaching the children in school, the children are coming in with behavioural problems because they reflect in school the stresses and strains which they are experiencing in their homes. Parents who are arguing, parents who've lost their jobs. So they come in, so the children and the young people are really challenging. They are they're having to stay in the classroom, same classroom all day. The teachers are having to manage the COVID security in the school, support the children and young people, teach them, and then provide distance learning on platforms they haven't been trained on. And remember that 700,000 children and young people in this country don't have any access to online, they don't have access to the internet, or they don't have laptops. And yet the government on Friday before half term said the laptops that we promised you we're not going to give you. They slashed the allocation of laptops. And the week before that, they put in a law through legislation that schools had to provide remote learning. That we are seeing, I was talking to one CEO of a multi-academy trust yesterday. They've got 4,400 teachers amongst 38 schools in the trust. On any one day, 400 of them are absent, either isolating or with COVID. So schools are just falling over because they do not have the teaching staff in order to do the teaching. And the reason for that is because they're not safe places. In secondary schools, the rate of COVID infection from the 1st of September to the 17th of October rose 50 times for secondary school pupils. And the rate of infection among secondary school pupils is now rising exponentially and is now higher, much higher than any other age group. Now, those pupils are not like to get COVID badly themselves. They get it and they will be largely asymptomatic. But we know now that secondary school pupils pass the infection on. We know because Sage has told us that the biggest viral transmission into the community is through secondary school pupils. So we're asking our teachers and support staff to go into crowded schools with no social distancing, with no PPE, with inadequate cleansing, and with inadequate staffing. And then we're saying to them on Wednesday, and by the way, you won't get a pay increase for 3 years. Now, tell me how that's going to make the profession attractive and how that's going to support educational standards in this country.
Thanks, Mary. I'm sure that's given our members a lot of food for thought, and I'm sure there will be a few questions that follow your contribution on that front. Thank you for that. Just a quick question to Zita. Zita, you're the Vice President of the PCS. I may have called it CPS. Apologies earlier. I've got lawyers on my mind at the minute, particularly with Sir Keir. The question is this. The Home Secretary last week made a statement saying if she's caused any upset, she is sorry. Where does that leave our society? Where does that leave civil servants who are not at the senior level as Sir Philip Rutnam, who is about to go to the Employment Tribunal? And what sort of message are we sending to our children in schools?
Well, it's sending quite a horrific message, isn't it? It's saying that harassment and bullying will be tolerated, but I think if it had been a more junior member of staff that had done something like that, there would have been a completely different reaction to them. So it's one rule for them and another rule for everybody else. We're talking about the Home Office, actually, where the Windrush Lessons Learned report was published in the middle of the pandemic, which had 30 recommendations for the Home Office to carry out to address race issues and the history of colonialism in the context of deportations and the Windrush generation. And there is a deportation flight happening to Jamaica in the middle of a pandemic when we're talking about safety of workers and people and people's human rights on the 3rd of December, which beggars belief. There is a campaign that I'm involved in against that, but it sends a horrific message that, and I think this is what we see a pattern of, don't we, with government? There's one rule for government ministers and another rule for everybody else. But just on the question about pay as well, our members in PCS have gone through 10 years of a pay freeze. And we're now talking about a situation where we're going to go through a longer period. The pay gap between black and white workers has widened, between women and men has widened. The equal pay gap has not been addressed. Some of our members have to claim the very benefits that they administer. Some of our members have to go to food banks. So how can that be right for people that are working for the government in the public sector to actually just be struggling above the poverty line to make ends meet and having to make really difficult choices about whether they feed their children or pay the bill that's coming in? So this is going to have really dire impacts on our members and their ability to survive. Working for the government, you should earn enough just to survive. Everybody should be earning a living wage, and the pay freeze that we've already experienced for a decade, in real terms, is a pay cut year on year, because the cost of living continues to go up each year. So it means that you're struggling every year and you've got less money in real terms coming in every year. We have a pay petition which has just reached 80,000 signatures as of today. We're trying to reach 100,000, so it triggers a debate in Parliament and puts the government under pressure. But it's an outrageous thing to do in the middle of a pandemic when families and workers are already struggling just to survive and get by at the moment.
Thank you, Rita, for that. That's a lot of food for thought. Again, a lot of questions arise from your contribution, particularly in relation to, we just lived through a period of austerity where the pressure on ordinary workers has been horrific, and particularly those on the breadline. And we see the consequences across the nation with the increasing number of food banks that are desperately trying to meet the needs in our communities. Question to Manuel now. You mentioned the economists in your contribution earlier on, Manuel. I mean, the jobs for chums and contracts for chums, billions of pounds are being paid out by the government without any formal scrutiny. The Good Law Project is on the case. They're trying to expose some of this in using the judicial system. Do you have much confidence that we will see some transparency around this going forward?
I mean, that's a really simple question to answer, but it's no. I have no confidence that we will see any transparency, and the reason for that is that the Tories are rewarding their shams. That's what they're doing. They're just rewarding their friends. And austerity was a political choice. It wasn't an economic necessity. And if they impose austerity now, once again, it will be a political choice. And Howard was absolutely right when he picked up the point about who pays for this crisis, because that's the most important question going forward. Is it going to be ordinary people, a lot of whom have been heroes because they've been following government advice by staying at home, or they have been at work to keep our country moving and to ensure that those who are sick are seen to? Are we going to ask those people to pay through a wage freeze? Or are we going to ask, those who have got wealth to actually put their shoulders to the wheel? And that, to me, is the crucial thing about what happens going forward. Clearly, we need a cure for COVID. We don't want to see anybody else die. We need to get our economy moving again. But when we've done all that, there's going to be a shortfall. We've been borrowing money. And that was the right thing to do. And we should continue to borrow money to invest. But if there has to be an increase in taxation, it should fall on those with the broadest shoulders. And there's lots of people out there with very broad shoulders who the Tories have shielded from this crisis and have shielded from paying the fair share of taxes. And those are the people that should be paying for this. And when it comes specifically to our union and what position we're going to be taking when it comes to a wage freeze, I tell you what, where our members want to fight it, we will be joining them on the picket lines.
Thanks very much. I started the question, then you gave a very simple answer, no. I think that's quite befitting. I mean, given what's going on, I mean, I think Specsavers are looking to open a branch at the Bernard Castle very soon. There is expansion in the economy, but it's going in a different direction. Question to you, Howard. I mean, you recently took the government to task as a union, and I think the issue was the right to picket during the pandemic. Howard, do you want to sort of talk a bit more broadly about that as to why you felt the necessity during a national emergency that you have to take the government to task to fight the rights for workers and particularly your members? And the other thing, 70% of the women working in the NHS, they're facing these crises. There's a whole host of issues linked to that about mental health, the rates of domestic violence that have gone through the roof, and the inability for agencies in our communities to meet that particular need. I would welcome your views on that, and particularly from the Unite angle in relation to, how you're fighting the corner for your members on this.
Well, thanks, Inderjeet. Well, yes, we did take the government to court. We had a judicial review in respect of the right to picket at Optar in northeast of England, but it could have been at Rolls-Royce, who are also on strike in the northwest of England, because at the moment what's happening in the employment field is outrageous. And that's not to say that every single employer is a bad employer, but I'm afraid COVID has shone a light on it. And I don't think this debate really should be about public or private workers. It should be about workers, and it should be about workers not paying for this crisis. Optar is a manufacturer where our members were told that their work is essential. They were forced into the workplace, told that it was safe. They had issues with the employer, have issues with the employer in respect of pay and terms and conditions, and the government and the police told them that their picket was unlawful in COVID. So it was against the rules in respect of outside meetings, and the picket line was moved on. So it was apparently safe for them to meet each other inside a confined workplace, but it was not safe for them to put a picket up outside that workplace, having conducted a lawful industrial ballot. So yes, we challenged the government, took it to a judicial review, and the government conceded it on the day. And it's vitally important because of everything that Manuel referenced. If we are to have an argument, a discussion, a debate about whether or not workers pay for this crisis or whether or not wealth pays for this crisis, then the right of workers to withdraw their labour is absolutely essential. We cannot have a situation where the likes of British Airways return to making £2 billion a year, but consistently keep the types of terms and conditions that they forced upon people during crisis. So the right to strike is absolutely vital. And I would just say this for everybody listening, that we are not talking about wealth in respect of is it the type of individual wealth that we all consider to be normal. If we look at the owner of Amazon, Bezos, who has increased his own personal wealth by £65 billion during this crisis, then you get an impression of where wealth is going to at the moment of crisis. And yes, you're quite right to shine a light in respect of the equality issues that come out in respect of this, the efforts that we need to go to. Zita has already talked about it eloquently in respect of the challenge that is before us, in respect of all minority communities, and obviously in respect of females. So it is paramount for us as a union, Inderjeet, that we do not allow those inequalities to persist.
Thank you, Howard, for that. Just one final note from me before I open it up to our respective sort of audience and members. I mean, the Chancellor's, through the Institute of Fiscal Studies, kind of been releasing figures and flying some kites, as they say, ahead of the statement in the House of Commons on Wednesday. He's borrowed something in the order of £350 billion so far. The national debt's gone up to something like £2 trillion. And I think all the panelists have kind of agreed this is a time to invest in infrastructure, retain the jobs, skill up the workforce. Is this an opportunity you think you will take on Wednesday? Any of you?
I mean, I don't think they're going to take it because the Tories are ideologically opposed to large-scale public investment. It shouldn't just be an opportunity to upskill our economy, It should be an opportunity to prepare our economy for the challenges of this century, and that means for decarbonization. Now is the time to start to invest in the products of the future.
Thanks.
Can I come in on that? I think they will make a few announcements, like they've made a few announcements on the, the green energy, etc. But if you look at that, that's recycled money.
Yes.
And infrastructure and investment is not just physical infrastructure; it's also the human infrastructure.
Yes.
And if we don't have decent public services, and we don't have decent hospitals and schools with decently paid workers in them doing that essential job, then then you don't have the infrastructure, either physical or the human infrastructure, in order to build and improve as a society. And that's just a hard lesson which the Tories continually fail to learn.
Thanks, Mary. Appreciate that. I'm going to open it up to our members now. Trevor Peel, you had a question. Welcome.
Thanks, Inderjeet. First of all, thank you very much to all four speakers who've been excellent. I chair the National Liberal Club's European Forum and also the National Liberal Club's Commonwealth Forum. So my question is, how does your trade union work internationally on behalf of the global workforce?
I'm happy to take that, Inderjeet. Insofar as Unite's work, we work closely. We have a structure, Trevor, called Workers Uniting, which works closely with trade unions around the world, mainly in Canada and America, but also in Mexico. And Mary, who is president of the TUC, recently will be able to talk about the connects that we have all around the world in respect of those countries where workers are seen as fodder, really. And our work internationally is standout and has connected trade unionism in a way that previously it just wouldn't have been connected. And I think it's fair to say that that has grown over the last 10 to 15 years since Francis has been in as the TUC General Secretary. And really the international stamp that we have put on the trade union movement is second to none.
I think that's absolutely right. And I was very proud as president of the work that the TUC International department did, particularly, in places in the world, for example, like Colombia, which is the most dangerous place in the world to be a trade unionist, particular teacher trade unionist. But also for the National Education Union, we are an affiliate of Education International, which is the worldwide body for education trade unionism. And that's really important, because that, if you are being, as a teacher, if you're in Colombia and you're jailed, you're highly likely to come out of that jail dead, having been tortured. And so what Education International does is, in those places in the world where if the authorities are interested in you because you're teaching the wrong thing in their view, then they're first there to publicize this, to get a press notice out. And the number of I was talking to somebody recently who from Bahrain, who had been imprisoned and tortured because speaking up for democracy in Bahrain, and said when Education International took up her case, she ended up having the Bahrain Minister of Justice phoning her every day to find out how she was being treated in prison, because all these people were writing emails to Bahrain in order to ask what was happening to her. So international trade unionism is absolutely key, particularly for those countries where it is dangerous to be a trade unionist. And unfortunately, there are far too many of those.
Thanks, Mary. I'll move on to Nahul, who's our international member based in Sweden.
Hi, thank you, Inderjeet, and thank you to the members of the panel for taking the time to be here. I wonder what the panel thought about collective agreements, which are quite common in many countries in continental Europe. Could they be part of a solution to address some of the issues that have emerged from the pandemic, like support for mental health, working from home if the job allows it, wage increases or profit sharing when the company does well, minimum holidays for gig workers in the gig economy, for example, that kind of thing?
Did you want anybody in particular to answer that, Nahul?
No, I guess it doesn't matter. I don't know. Perhaps some of you have more experience of collective agreements. I know that are less common in the UK than others. But they also mean, yeah.
Well, a lack of collective agreements can be correlated with the loss of wage amongst trade union members and workers generally. So you're quite right to raise it. It's only a matter of 30 years ago or so where there was almost 80% of the population who were subject to a collective agreement, and now it's in the 20%. And as a consequence of that, you see workers' wages in real terms reduced, and that does not help the economy. It is the fact that every day we are working hard to try and get more collective agreements in workplaces. We are looking at changes to collective agreements to deal with home working and obviously to deal with safety at work as a result of the COVID crisis. But really our demand as a movement is very much about sector collective agreements. It's very much about having thresholds within sectors for which you cannot go below. And if I take the example of hospitality at the moment, hospitality was tips were left out at the first furlough arrangements, and as everybody will know, tips form a large part of the wage for anybody who's working in hospitality, but they were omitted from the furlough arrangement. And probably, as everybody knows, the furlough agreement does not prevent people from going below the minimum wage. And the reason for that is because the minimum wage only applies when you're in work, and if you're furloughed, you're not thought of as being in work. So the 80% for those who are in the hospitality sector in real terms means that they have fallen below the minimum wage. So our demand as a movement, and it reflected in the Labour Party's manifesto, particularly in 2017, is about bringing in sector barriers below which you cannot go, caps below which you cannot go, allowing us to negotiate on a sector basis so as we can deal with the gig economy and deal with precarious work and deal with umbrella companies and all of the other scams that go about in order to avoid paying workers their real wage.
Thanks, Howard. Mary, I was going to touch upon this collective bargaining and go back in time where I recall during the Blair-Brown era where your predecessor organisation, National Union of Teachers, were barred from one Secretary of State, Charles Clarke, for actually coming in and engaging the then Department for Children, Schools and Families, I think it was called. That was quite a tortuous period in the history of the NUT, I think. But it's come a long way, given where you are today talking to Nick Gibb.
Well, actually, I was General Secretary of the Association of Teachers and Lecturers, which was the other half that joined with the NUT to form the National Education Union. And, you know, at that time, the two organisations made different choices. It was really focused on the workload agreement, which was an exercise in social partnership with the Labour government. And the key sticking point for the NUT was that that workload agreement gave support staff, educational support staff, a greater role in schools, including the ability to cover classes. And for that, teachers got for the first time planning, preparation and assessment time, and a whole raft of collective agreements which did actually tackle workload in schools and change the nature of the relationship with government. And certainly when I think about that time of social partnership from 2003 to 2010, I became General Secretary of ATL in 2003. Actually, it started before that. It started in 2002. And I think about the close working we had with ministers and with civil servants, and the ability to look at the issues in the sector and to talk them through properly, and then to work through systemic ways of tackling the achievement gap, of tackling low aspiration, of tackling significant overwork, particularly by teachers in school, of tackling teacher recruitment and retention, and coming up with really, really good proposals, which were then worked through with the union. And the thing about, if you look at what the OECD says about education, it says the best education policies are worked through with the profession, and we are the profession's representatives. Since 2010, we haven't had that, and we've seen education reform done without the agreement of the profession. And the consequences of that are very clear now. They're very clear in terms of appalling teacher retention rates. They're very clear in terms of a widening gap in educational standards between the most advantaged and the most deprived. So the gap now went into reverse before the virus struck and is now reversing very, very quickly. And so if you don't involve the profession through the unions in systemic answers to systemic problems, then you will miss an awful lot, which can make those answers really stick and change for the good. It's really hard to do.
I buy the co-production, and particularly what you have shared with us. I mean, just in a nutshell, this more one-sentence answer. Do you think the coalition government between from 2010 onwards, it focused very much on social mobility? Nick Clegg, especially the Liberal Democrat Party in the coalition, was very big in the education space on social mobility with Sarah Tether, David Laws, etc. Do you think that kind of legacy is still in where you are at the moment? Is that still in play?
Well, I'm going to say something really shocking, that I don't think social mobility is a useful concept. Because social mobility, if you're really going to have social mobility, as you did in the 60s, actually, the reason you have social mobility in the 60s, and that is that working class people, young people rose to the middle class, was because that was an area of, that was a time of expansion of the state, and expansion of the sort of jobs which working class young people could move into. Teaching is one, work in the health service is the other, social work. There was a huge expansion of the state, which enabled people to move from low-paid jobs into a profession. You can't have social mobility at a time when the state is shrinking, because what happens then is the middle-class parents, totally understandably, hold on to the best jobs for their offspring. They will do everything they can to get their children into the best schools and to have the social capital and the cultural capital to enable them to succeed. And what that means is that poor children have to be extraordinary in order to be socially mobile. And that's the point I always make. You don't want social mobility, you want social justice. And if you're going to really have social justice, you will do much more to stop child poverty. And I'll finish with this. 40% of the attainment gap between poor children and middle-class children is set in stone before they start school. That's not my statistics, that's the Education Policy Institute. So if you're born into a poor house with parents who can't afford to clothe you properly, can't afford to feed you properly, can't afford to house you properly, have all the stresses and strains in their relationship which poverty brings, can't afford to give you cultural initiation into museums and holidays, all those things and worse, set in stone a 40% achievement gap before you start school, and then it widens throughout that. So I don't think that social mobility is a useful concept. I could talk about it for a long time.
Which I didn't expect. Thank you so much for clarifying that, social mobility, social justice. I'm conscious that both Manuel and Howard need to depart at this point to join the other meeting. I'd like to thank you both, and the invitation is open once we are over this lockdown to visit us at the club. Now, I've got 3 further questions here that I can see from members. Can I invite the panel, Zita and Mary, if you can limit your responses to these so we can get through them. We can go over until about 7:10. That's kind of limit. We've got about 15 minutes. So can I invite Kulwant Bowler, our member in London, to ask the next question?
Hi, yeah, I was relying on Howard being there, but never mind. Only because Howard talked about the situation as binary, big business versus low-paid workers, dividends versus reasonable wages. Hasn't it just been thus in recent history? And what can the unions, indeed the rest of us, do within COVID times and onwards to make this a not so binary state of play?
Interesting. Zita, you want to pick this one up?
Well, I think we should be in a society where we don't leave anybody behind. And that's what we're seeing, you know, that some workers are more vulnerable, are facing more poverty, and it's the workers who already face the most discrimination and injustice, who are in the most precarious jobs and low paid jobs, and you know, maybe don't want social mobility, but want to survive, or actually do more than survive and be able to live, to be able to have some stability, to take care of their families and know they have a regular income coming in, and not that they have to phone up once a week to find out if there is any work going to come their way from one week to another. You can't live like that. You can't plan for the future. And I think we have to look at the next generation. We need to look at young people. They can't even get a foot on the property ladder. They can't get stable work. They have tuition fees. That means that some of them can't even go into further and higher education because they can't afford it. And if we don't ensure that everybody has a living wage and can live rather than just survive, that has a knock-on impact on their families. I think there is already touched on child poverty. Britain, to have one of the worst rates of child poverty is actually really shameful. That shouldn't be happening in the UK. It shouldn't be happening anywhere in the world, but there's no excuse for it in the UK.
Thank you. Kulwant, because of a necessity, Howard had to go. I should have said that earlier. Perhaps I think he joined us a bit late. But we'll catch up afterwards. I'll give you another opportunity to have a conversation. Thank you very much, Zita, for that. I've got Noel, chair of our Defence and Security Circle, next.
Oh, thank you very much, Inderjeet, and thank you to what must have been a great planning team. My question to the speakers: what's the challenge for the broader trade union movement and the membership from what looks like the new normal? Because a significant proportion of trade unionists are not wedded to one political party or to one political perspective. People are facing some real challenges at this time of crisis.
Yeah, I think they are, and I think the trade union movement has a whole lot of challenges. So the National Education Union isn't politically affiliated; it's not affiliated to any political party, and we work with all political parties and a whole range of stakeholders. So we're the only union that stands at the Labour, Lib Dem, Green and the Conservative Party conferences. We speak with the all politicians. We speak with the Conservative Education Society. We speak with the Lib Dem Education Society. We speak with Labour. We speak with the Greens, and a whole wide range of stakeholders. Now, you're absolutely right. I think changes in working patterns really do pose issues to trade unions. Not so much to education trade unions, because our members are in the workplace. You can't educate pupils remotely all the time from home, and schools are really important as places not just for education but for socialization for children and young people. Schools where you learn about what your responsibilities are beyond your family, and schools are where children go to work, and they are where children learn to socialize and learn to meet people who are different from themselves. But for many businesses, for many trade unions, the rise of the gig economy, the new patterns of work mean that it is less likely that you are going to be in the workplace. The chances of recruiting people in the workplace are fewer, and the challenge of saying that collectivism is strength is more difficult to make. I don't believe, however, that is impossible. I don't believe that's impossible. And I think if we look in the pandemic, where more people have been working from home, in the majority of unions, the membership of unions has increased, because actually if you're working from home and you are employed by an employer who is not providing effective terms and conditions, not providing with a living wage, not providing with security of work, then that isolation you have at home is compounded by the isolation you have from working from home. And that means that, members are actually joining unions, and the trade union membership tally across all unions has grown.
Mary, just on that point, your membership has gone up by 50,000. the lockdown period you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
And then something like 10 million hit on your website. That's phenomenal over a course of a month. I mean, what's the secret? What is it that they are looking for on your website, the members and potential members?
So I think the secret is, first of all, that we just have a group of colleagues who we've employed who are really fantastic on social media, on being able to track where. So now it's the case that over half our membership are joined online, and many of those are joined because we've tracked them on Facebook and on Google, because we know they're interested in education, and we put the NEU in front of them. We take them to our website. We've made it really easy to join. But if you go on our website, you will find it's beautifully clear. It's got front and center, it's got coronavirus and you, and then you go into it, and then you've got specialist advice for all the different sections of membership: independent sector, state school sector, special schools, supply teachers, FE colleges, sixth form, and we've worked really hard to make the advice and guidance clear and accessible. We've set up a parents website which has had hundreds of thousands of views, where we put schemes of work for work that parents can do at home with their children. And then we engage in our campaigning missions, campaigning on child poverty, campaigning on our international issues, campaigning on better working conditions and better professionalism for our staff, campaigning on assessment, campaigning on the curriculum. And so you engage in campaigning with parents around accountability, campaigning with parents around what sort of education do they want for their children. And so what you try and do is you try and create a community around the union, a community of members, but also a community of people who are interested in education and want to know what the union is doing and saying about education. So just last week, I handed in a petition to the DFE with one of our members, a member from Sheffield, with over 70,000 signatures of members saying we've got to do more than put the GCSE and A-levels 3 weeks later. That's not enough. So it's about engaging people in issues and in content which they think is valuable and useful. And if you do that, they will come to the union.
Thank you. That's a very comprehensive answer, and one that we need to learn from. And you're absolutely right. If you're the only channel for information for parents in particular and carers, they will go to your website for that information in lieu of what the DFE is miserably failing to provide. Yeah. I'm going to go to our final question for this evening from the chair of the club, Rupert Morris.
Hello, Mary and Zita, and thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's been good to have a trade unionist perspective on current events. Mine is a simple question. What's the effect of the pandemic been on numbers, on your membership, on recruitment? Because I can see the logic of wanting to join a union at a time of stress like this. On the other hand, you know, people are losing their jobs, so maybe it's generally downwards. How is it for you, and are you aware of other unions where perhaps you know, numbers are going up, or how has it been?
So for my union, the National Education Union, we've had 50,000 new joiners during the pandemic. Now, people leave as well. There's always turnover. So on balance, we're about 25,000 members up since the start of the pandemic. We think that's probably the biggest growth of any of the TUC affiliated unions. I was just talking previously, we had a Zoom call on the 18th of May with 20,000 members online. So when members need you, or when potential members need you, if you reach out to them and make it easy for them to join and make them easy for them. I mean, we run now Zoom calls with the membership every month. So that means every month any member can sign on to a Zoom call and have both their joint general secretaries online, talking to them and answering their questions. We're doing 2 of those on Friday. So really, we've used new technology, Zoom in particular, to organise in new ways. and to involve more members, and the results have been astounding. And one of the things that we're really now thinking about is how do we carry on using that new technology, because there's no point in a union which is 73% women thinking that they're going to work from 7:30 in the morning till 5:30 in the evening, go home and look after their children, and then go out again for a branch meeting at 7 o'clock, which might be in a pub. It's not going to happen. So how do we use that new technology to keep that newfound activism in the union? And absolutely the issue of gender and race are absolutely at the core of that. Who is the union for? How do we organise internally to ensure that our members really can be active in their union?
Thank you, Mary. Zita, how's it been for the artists and performers and well, civil service goes without saying? Is there a bounce in membership, or is it the other way around?
So Artists Union England is not on the scale of NEU, you know, we're a smaller union and a younger union, and we do have a turnover. And the reason we have a constant turnover is because our members are sometimes out of work for periods of time, then they get some work and they rejoin. But actually what we've seen during the pandemic, because we've been active, we've set up a solidarity fund to try and help struggling artists through this period. We've been lobbying the government, we've done an online petition, we've been able to organise, you know, differently, as has already been mentioned by Mary, by using Zoom and social media platforms. And we have had a real buzz and a real interest, and not just members joining, new members joining, but people wanted to get actively involved and, you know, bring their skills and knowledge to the table, whether it's on disability issues or whether it's on climate change, and really start participating and getting active in the union and recognising the importance of a union. And I think one thing, you know, with both of our unions is that we have been really working non-stop, because there's a constant need to respond to our members' needs. Our members have faced unprecedented times, like everybody has, across the UK and across the world globally. But they have really needed their union more than ever during this period, with all of the challenges they've had to face, whether that's been because they're frontline workers and they've been told to go out to work, whether it's because they're in a high risk group and they need to be protected, or whether it's because they're working at home and trying to balance new technology, childcare, homeschooling and caring for other elderly or vulnerable relatives. They have needed their union more than ever. And so there has been a real engagement, I think, and a recognition of the crucial importance of trade unions during this time. That's
a nice comment to finish on that particular question. Can I invite Val and Nick to provide a joint word of thanks?
Well, thanks, Inderjeet. I'll go first. I'm Nick Kirby, and dubious honour of being a General Committee member of the National Liberal Club and Pensions Officer of the National Education Union. Beat that. Well, I'd like to thank Inderjeet and the Political and Economic Circle for putting on this event. It's very useful to build bridges between you know, trade unionists and the broader progressive movement, in which I include the National Liberal Club, the most diverse club in London. And also, I'd just like to thank Tim McAnally for keeping the technology upright. Zoom does work eventually. So thank you very much, Tim, and I'll hand over to Val.
Okay, thanks for Nick. Sorry you can't see me. That may or may not be a good thing or a bad thing, but I just can't get my bit of technology to work to give you my picture. However, for anybody who does want to see me, when the club opens on the 3rd of December, there will be terrace tables. So come along to that and you'll find out what it looks like. The real part of this for me, though, is to say thank you to all of our speakers, especially to Zita and Howard, who dropped in at the last minute during today. That's really very helpful, and the broad knowledge and considerations that each of the four of you has brought has been really very good. I was talking to Inderjeet earlier today, and on the basis of the numbers that have joined us, I think we can hopefully make this at least an annual event. So we may come back to you later. But finally, as well, I just want to thank for all the members and guests who came and joined us for this new offer from the club. So thank you all for joining us on this event, and look forward to seeing as many of you as possible in the club as soon as we open.
Thank you very much, Val and Nick, for those nice words. I mean, we're completing our 132 years as we speak as a circle. We will come back, re-energize, refocus as we emerge from the second lockdown in January. And we would look at initially, I think, things like what does the Biden presidency mean for the UK and particularly our economy post-Brexit. And then we're looking at other themes like the successive governments where they've failed to engage with the housing market, the housing crisis, the homelessness, and the generation rent. These are just kind of some of the things that we'll be looking to engage with in the new year. Can I thank everybody, particularly our members and guests who've tuned in this evening, and also take this opportunity to thank Mary, Zita, Howard and Noel for linking up with us and making this event a success. And also finally to thank Tim, Teves and Jonathan, who've linked up and supported the infrastructure for this evening. And finally also to Amrit Maan, who's joined as the Political Economic Circle to support us this evening. I'll bid you a good evening and thank you for joining. Bye-bye.